Hello and welcome to Law and Sleep. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, if you're new around here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. I love seeing just how far this quiet little corner of the internet reaches. Now get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight we travel toward one of the oldest and most quietly ambitious of all human intellectual projects. The simple, enormous task of trying to draw the world, to take the whole vast, unseeable shape of the earth, or even just the small familiar corner of it that a person actually knew, and press it down onto something flat enough to carry, small enough to hold, and clear enough to actually help the next traveller find their way. We are going to trace the long history of mapmaking and cartography across the ancient and medieval world, from the very first scratched marks on clay and bone through the great cartographic traditions of Babylon, Greece, Rome, China, the medieval Islamic world, and medieval Christian Europe, following the slow, patient, often quite creative process by which human beings gradually learn to picture a world most of them would never see the whole of. This is the story of mapmakers working with extraordinarily limited direct knowledge of the actual world they were trying to represent, filling in the edges of what they knew with myth, with rumour, with pure invention, and sometimes, remarkably, with genuinely careful mathematical calculation, long before anyone had ever seen the earth from above, long before anyone could cross an ocean and confirm what actually lay on the other side. It is a story about the particular, very human courage it takes to commit an uncertain picture of the world to a permanent surface anyway, knowing full well how much of it was likely wrong, and about how much genuine, hard-won geographic understanding nonetheless accumulated, map by careful map, across so many centuries and so many civilizations that rarely had any way of comparing notes with one another. It is a story that belongs to the night in its own particular way, since a map, more than almost any other kind of ancient document, was so often consulted by exactly this kind of low, steady lamplight, a traveller or a sea captain leaning close over a table, tracing a possible route with one careful finger, trying to decide, in the quiet hours before a long journey, whether the way ahead was actually as it had been drawn. Let it come to you now, slowly, the soft rustle of an old parchment map being carefully unrolled, warm lamplight falling across painted coastlines and painted mountains, and the quiet, patient attention of someone trying to understand a world considerably larger than themselves. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the quiet of an old map room at night come to you out of the darkness, warm lamplight, the soft smell of aged parchment, and the gentle, unhurried sense of a whole world waiting patiently to be traced. Let us begin. Polynesian wayfinding navigators, already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy in connection with their own sophisticated star compass navigational system, represent perhaps the single most historically significant example anywhere in the world of successful long-distance human navigation achieved entirely without any physical drawn map, since Polynesian voyagers successfully settled thousands of scattered Pacific islands across many centuries using nothing more than memorized celestial patterns, memorized ocean swell patterns, and careful observation of birds, clouds, and other natural indicators of nearby land. A genuinely remarkable navigational achievement that this whole episode's own primary focus on physical, drawn cartography should not be allowed to overshadow or diminish. The genuinely sophisticated oral and memorized geographic knowledge that sustained human wayfinding across these many tens of thousands of years depended substantially on a practice modern anthropologists studying comparable surviving indigenous traditions call songline or dreaming track navigation, in which a specific sequence of landmarks, water sources, and seasonal indicators was encoded within a memorized narrative, song, or ritual sequence, allowing a trained traveller to essentially recite their own way across an enormous stretch of territory, a genuinely sophisticated cognitive cartographic technology, requiring no physical drawn representation whatsoever. And this same basic oral wayfinding tradition, this episode's second chapter will examine in fuller connection with Aboriginal Australian songlines, specifically persisted in active practical use across numerous indigenous cultures worldwide, for many thousands of years after other civilizations had already begun producing physical drawn maps, illustrating that physical cartography represents merely one among several genuinely viable and genuinely sophisticated human approaches to organizing and transmitting spatial knowledge, rather than any inevitable or universally necessary stage of human geographic development. Human beings navigated across considerable distances for many tens of thousands of years before anyone ever produced anything resembling a formal map, relying instead on the same kind of memorized landmark sequences, celestial observation, and orally transmitted route knowledge already examined in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy and Polynesian wayfinding navigation, a genuinely sophisticated body of practical geographic knowledge that required no physical drawn representation at all, since the map itself, in a very real sense, lived entirely inside the memory of the traveller who had learned it, passed down through careful oral instruction from one experienced guide to the next. The considerable cognitive and neurological research that modern scientists have conducted into how the human brain actually processes and stores spatial information suggests that this same ancient, purely mental form of cartography draws on genuinely deep and genuinely ancient neurological structures, including specialized brain regions that modern neuroscientists have found respond specifically to spatial location and spatial navigation, a genuinely fascinating modern scientific confirmation that the human capacity for map-making, whether expressed through physical drawing or through purely internal mental representation, appears to be built on genuinely deep and genuinely evolutionarily ancient cognitive foundations, considerably predating not merely written cartography, but quite possibly the modern human species itself. The earliest surviving physical objects that modern archaeologists consider genuine candidates for the world's first maps considerably predate any of the great literate civilizations this episode's later chapters will examine in detail, including a fragment of mammoth tusk recovered in modern Ukraine and dated to roughly 25,000 years before the Common Era, whose carved markings some archaeologists have proposed represent a schematic depiction of a nearby river and surrounding dwellings, though the specific interpretation of these earliest and most fragmentary pieces of evidence remains, appropriately, a matter of genuine ongoing scholarly debate, given how difficult it is to establish definitive cartographic intent behind marks scratched into bone or ivory by people who left behind no accompanying written explanation of their own purpose. A considerably later and considerably more elaborately painted candidate for an early map comes from the Neolithic settlement of Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, where archaeologists recovered a wall mural dated to approximately 6200 before the Common Era, depicting what many archaeologists interpret as a schematic town plan showing rows of houses laid out beneath what appears to be an erupting volcano, a genuinely striking and genuinely early example, if this particular archaeological interpretation is correct, of a settled community deliberately depicting both its own immediate physical surroundings and a notable, memorable natural landmark on the same fixed painted surface. Though, as with the earlier prehistoric evidence already discussed in this chapter, some modern archaeologists have proposed alternative, non-cartographic interpretations of this same considerably ambiguous ancient artwork. The Bedolina petroglyph, a considerably later prehistoric rock carving found in northern Italy and dated to sometime within the Bronze Age, presents a genuinely more confidently interpreted case, depicting what appears to be a schematic representation of an actual settled landscape, including paths, fields, and structures, laid out in a manner that several modern archaeologists consider a genuinely deliberate and genuinely recognizable early map, offering a rare direct glimpse into how a prehistoric European community may have chosen to represent its own immediate surrounding territory on a fixed, permanent surface, rather than relying purely on oral or memorized geographic knowledge. Comparable prehistoric rock art with genuinely plausible cartographic content has been identified at numerous additional sites across the wider prehistoric world, including examples in Spain, Turkey, and various sites across the Americas, a genuinely widespread pattern of scattered, geographically dispersed prehistoric cartographic experimentation that, taken together, suggests that the basic human impulse to render spatial and territorial knowledge onto a fixed physical surface arose independently and repeatedly across numerous entirely separate prehistoric human communities, well before any of these same communities could possibly have had any direct contact or any direct cultural exchange with one another regarding this particular practice. The practical difficulty inherent in confidently interpreting any of this earliest and most fragmentary prehistoric cartographic evidence deserves genuine acknowledgement, since the considerable interpretive gap separating a modern archaeologist from the actual original intent of a mark scratched into stone or bone many thousands of years ago means that even the most carefully argued modern scholarly interpretation of any single piece of prehistoric evidence this chapter has examined necessarily remains, to some genuine degree, an informed and reasonable guess rather than any kind of definitively established historical fact, a genuinely appropriate note of scholarly humility to carry forward into this whole episode's later chapters, where the considerably more abundant surviving textual and cartographic evidence from literate civilizations allows for considerably more confident historical interpretation. The earliest surviving map that modern historians can date and interpret with genuine confidence comes from ancient Mesopotamia in the form of a small clay tablet known as the Babylonian Map of the world, dating to sometime around the 6th century before the Common Era, and depicting the city of Babylon at the center of a circular world surrounded by a ring of water with several outlying regions and, notably, a series of triangular projections labeled as distant, mythical lands lying beyond the known world's own edge. A genuinely fascinating early example of exactly the kind of blending between accurate local geographic knowledge and speculative, mythologically informed distant geography that this episode's second chapter will examine as a recurring and genuinely widespread pattern across numerous ancient cartographic traditions. The earliest surviving map that modern historians can date and interpret with genuine confidence comes from ancient Mesopotamia in the form of a small clay tablet known as the Babylonian Map of the world, dating to sometime around the 6th century before the Common Era, and depicting the city of Babylon at the center of a circular world surrounded by a ring of water, with several outlying regions and, notably, a series of triangular projections labeled as distant, mythical lands lying beyond the known world's own edge. And this single small surviving tablet, no larger than the palm of an ordinary hand, stands today as the oldest known physical object anywhere in the world that any modern historian can point to with genuine confidence and say, quite simply, this was made specifically to show someone what the world looked like. A genuinely humbling thought when set beside the enormous, continuously updating digital maps that billions of ordinary people now carry in their own pockets every single day without a second thought. The tablet's own accompanying cuneiform text, describing these same distant triangular regions in genuinely fantastical terms, including references to mythical beasts and legendary heroes, illustrates a genuinely important early pattern this whole episode will trace repeatedly across many subsequent centuries and many subsequent civilizations. The tendency of ancient mapmakers to render their own directly known, directly experienced local geography with reasonable care and reasonable accuracy, while filling the map's own more distant, unknown edges with myth, legend, and pure invention, a genuinely honest reflection of the actual limits of what any single ancient civilization could realistically claim to know about the wider world beyond its own immediate horizon. Ancient Egyptian cartographic practice, though producing comparatively few surviving examples of wider geographic world maps, developed genuinely sophisticated practical mapping techniques applied to more immediate, more local surveying needs, including detailed cadastral maps recording individual land plots along the Nile, essential for the annual practical work of re-establishing property boundaries following the river's own regular flooding already discussed in this channel's earlier coverage of both ancient astronomy and ancient Egypt more broadly, and the surviving Turin papyrus map, dated to around 1200 before the Common Era, and depicting a specific mining region in the Eastern Desert, represents one of the oldest surviving topographical maps anywhere in the ancient world, showing considerable practical geological and geographic detail intended for the genuinely practical purpose of guiding actual mining expeditions. The Egyptian rope stretchers already discussed in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy in connection with pyramid construction and true north alignment applied genuinely comparable practical surveying skill to the ordinary, recurring task of Nile floodplain land measurement, using knotted ropes of standardized length to establish accurate boundary lines and accurate right angles across freshly re-exposed agricultural land, a genuinely essential and genuinely widely practiced ancient Egyptian surveying profession whose own practical mathematical techniques, according to several ancient Greek sources including Herodotus, directly influenced the subsequent development of Greek geometry, a discipline whose very name derives from Greek words meaning literally earth measurement, a genuinely direct etymological link connecting the whole subsequent history of mathematical geometry back to this same practical ancient Egyptian land surveying tradition. The practical necessity of organizing and communicating spatial knowledge extended well beyond the specific literate civilizations already discussed in this chapter, with indigenous peoples across the world, including the Pacific Islander navigators already examined in this channel's own coverage of the Silk Road and ancient astronomy, developing their own genuinely sophisticated non-paper cartographic traditions, most remarkably the stick charts constructed by Marshall Islander navigators, using carefully arranged sticks and shells to represent wave patterns, swells, and island positions across the open Pacific Ocean. A genuinely abstract and genuinely sophisticated cartographic system representing not fixed physical landmarks, but rather the dynamic, moving patterns of ocean swells that a trained navigator needed to recognize and interpret while actually at sea. A form of map-making this episode's remaining chapters, focused substantially on more conventional flat, static representations of land, will not examine in comparable further detail, but one that deserves genuine recognition as a full, independently developed cartographic tradition in its own right. This genuinely wide diversity of early human approaches to representing and communicating spatial knowledge, from memorized oral route sequences to carved petroglyphs, to clay tablets to arranged sticks and shells, reflects a genuinely universal human need that this whole episode will trace across many different specific cartographic traditions, the practical and, in time, increasingly intellectual desire to somehow capture and communicate a shape of the world too large for any single person to ever directly perceive all at once, a need that this episode's remaining chapters will demonstrate every single subsequent civilization this whole episode examines would go on to address in its own particular way, shaped by its own particular available materials, its own particular practical needs, and its own particular understanding of what the wider world actually contained. Nearly every ancient civilization whose cosmological and geographic traditions survive in any detail developed some considerable body of belief regarding the overall shape and structure of the world, frequently blending genuine accumulated practical geographic knowledge of the immediate, directly experienced local landscape, with considerably more speculative and considerably more mythologically informed understanding of distant, unvisited regions, a genuinely widespread pattern already briefly introduced in this episode's first chapter in connection with the Babylonian map of the world's own mythological outer regions. This same pattern of ancient and medieval mapmakers marking the unknown edges of their own geographic knowledge with warnings, legends, and depictions of dangerous mythical creatures produced a considerable and genuinely enduring cartographic tradition, whose own most famous surviving expression, the phrase "here be dragons," though considerably less commonly actually inscribed on genuine surviving historical maps than modern popular culture tends to assume, nonetheless captures a genuinely widespread and genuinely honest ancient and medieval cartographic practice of using the map's own physical edges to mark the genuine boundary between confirmed geographic knowledge and pure speculation, a practice this whole episode has already examined in connection with the Babylonian map of the world's own mythical triangular regions, and will continue to examine across several of this episode's remaining chapters. Ancient Mesopotamian cosmology, already briefly touched upon in this episode's first chapter, understood the world as a flat disk surrounded by a cosmic ocean, itself encircled by distant mountains supporting the sky above, a cosmological framework that shaped not only the specific Babylonian map of the world already discussed, but also the wider Mesopotamian mythological and religious understanding of the world's own fundamental structure, an understanding that considerably influenced through the region's own considerable cultural influence on the wider ancient Near East. The cosmological frameworks of several neighboring ancient civilizations, including through the shared cultural and scriptural tradition already discussed elsewhere in this channel's own coverage of the ancient Near East. Elements of the cosmological framework reflected within the Hebrew Bible's own early chapters. Ancient Greek Geographic and Cosmological Thought, which this episode's third chapter will examine in considerably fuller detail, underwent its own genuinely significant intellectual transformation across several centuries, moving from earlier mythological conceptions of the world as a flat disk encircled by the river Oceanus toward the considerably more mathematically sophisticated understanding of a spherical Earth that this episode's third chapter will examine at length, a transformation substantially connected to the same broader Greek philosophical tradition's own characteristic drive toward rational, systematic inquiry that this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy has already examined in considerable detail. Chinese cosmological thought, which this episode's fourth chapter will examine in considerable further detail, developed its own distinctive cosmological framework, understanding the world as fundamentally square, positioned beneath a circular heaven, a cosmological concept reflected directly in traditional Chinese architecture and traditional Chinese ritual practice, and Chinese geographic thought placed China itself, quite literally named in Chinese as the Middle Kingdom, at the conceptual center of this same cosmological framework, surrounded by increasingly distant and increasingly less civilized peoples, arranged in concentric zones extending outward from the civilized Chinese center, a genuinely distinctive cosmological and geographic worldview that considerably shaped the specific style and specific content of Chinese cartographic production this episode's fourth chapter will examine. Hindu cosmological and geographic tradition, developed across the Indian subcontinent, already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy and ancient medicine, understood the world through the framework of Jambudvipa, a central continental landmass organized around the cosmic Mount Meru and surrounded by concentric rings of ocean and additional continents, a genuinely elaborate cosmological geography preserved in considerable detail within surviving Hindu Puranic literature, and this same basic cosmological framework, transmitted alongside Buddhism through the trade and pilgrimage routes already examined extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of the Silk Road, considerably influenced the geographic and cosmological thinking of numerous other Asian civilizations, including several of the Southeast Asian kingdoms that adopted Indian religious and cosmological traditions alongside considerable other elements of Indian cultural influence. Buddhist cosmological tradition, developed from this same broader Indian religious and philosophical inheritance already discussed in this chapter, produced its own distinctive geographic and cosmological framework centered on Mount Sumeru, understood as the physical and spiritual axis around which the entire cosmos revolved, and Buddhist cosmological maps, produced across many centuries of continued Buddhist artistic and religious tradition from India through Tibet, China, and eventually Japan, frequently depicted this same cosmological structure with genuinely elaborate artistic detail, blending genuine geographic content regarding the actual known Asian world with the same kind of symbolic, religiously organized cosmological structure already examined throughout this chapter in connection with numerous other ancient and medieval religious traditions. Medieval Christian European cosmological thought, which this episode's sixth chapter will examine in considerable further detail, developed its own distinctive geographic and religious framework, understanding Jerusalem as the spiritual and, in several influential medieval cartographic traditions, the literal geographic center of the world, with the three known continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa arranged around this central holy city in a manner that reflected genuine theological conviction as much as any purely empirical geographic observation, a genuinely significant example of how deeply religious and cosmological belief shaped the actual physical layout of medieval maps. An approach to mapmaking this episode's sixth chapter will examine as genuinely distinct in its underlying purpose from the more purely practical navigational cartography this episode's later chapters will also examine. Norse cosmological and geographic tradition, developed across the same Scandinavian world already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of the Viking Age, understood the world through the framework of Yggdrasil, a great cosmic tree connecting 9 distinct worlds, a genuinely elaborate mythological cosmological structure that, while never producing anything resembling a conventional physical map in the sense this whole episode primarily examines, nonetheless organized Norse geographic and cosmological thinking around a genuinely systematic, if entirely mythological, spatial framework and surviving medieval Icelandic sources preserve considerable practical geographic knowledge regarding actual Norse maritime routes across the North Atlantic, including the specific sailing directions that guided Norse voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the North American coastline. Knowledge that, like the Aboriginal songlines and Marshall Islander stick charts already discussed elsewhere in this episode, was transmitted substantially through oral and written narrative rather than through any surviving physical Norse navigational chart. Ancient Israelite and wider Levantine geographic tradition, preserved substantially through the considerable body of surviving Hebrew scriptural and later rabbinic literature, understood the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem as occupying a genuinely central place within the wider divine ordering of the world. A theological geographic framework that, transmitted through the shared scriptural inheritance already examined elsewhere in this channel's own coverage of the ancient Near East, would go on to exercise genuinely direct and genuinely lasting influence on the medieval Christian European cartographic tradition. This episode's 6th chapter will examine in considerable further detail, since medieval Christian mapmakers inherited this same basic Jerusalem-centered geographic and theological framework directly from their own considerable scriptural inheritance. Ancient Persian and Zoroastrian geographic and cosmological tradition, developed across the same Persian cultural sphere, already examined extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of Persian history, understood the world through a framework dividing the Earth into 7 distinct climatic regions called keshvars, arranged around a central region corresponding to the Persian homeland itself, a cosmological and geographic framework that considerably influenced subsequent medieval Islamic geographic thought. Already examined extensively in this episode's 5th chapter, since the considerable Persian cultural and scholarly contribution to the wider medieval Islamic scientific and cartographic tradition carried this same basic 7-fold climatic geographic framework directly into the wider medieval Islamic scholarly mainstream. This same 7-fold climatic geographic framework, transmitted from its own original Persian and Zoroastrian source through the medieval Islamic geographic tradition already discussed in this chapter, would eventually reach ancient Greek geographic thought as well, where it took the form of a system dividing the inhabited world into distinct latitudinal climate zones, a genuinely significant piece of cross-cultural geographic transmission that this episode's 3rd chapter will examine further in connection with the wider ancient Greek geographic and astronomical tradition, illustrating once again just how thoroughly ideas about the world's own fundamental climatic and geographic structure traveled and mixed across the numerous different ancient civilizations this whole episode has traced, rather than developing in the kind of complete mutual isolation that a purely civilization by civilization historical account might otherwise suggest. Aztec geographic and cosmological tradition, developed by the same Mesoamerican civilization already examined in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient medicine, produced genuinely significant surviving cartographic material, including the Codex Mendoza and several other surviving Aztec manuscripts depicting territorial boundaries, tribute routes, and the systematic administrative geography of the Aztec Empire's own considerable territorial extent. And Aztec cosmological belief understood the world as divided into 4 cardinal directional quadrants radiating outward from a sacred central point, a cosmological framework genuinely comparable in its own basic underlying structure, despite complete independent development, to the concentric Chinese cosmological framework this episode's 4th chapter will examine, and the Jerusalem-centered medieval European framework this episode's 6th chapter will examine, a further genuinely striking example of how consistently ancient civilizations across the whole world, working in complete mutual isolation from one another, nonetheless arrived at broadly comparable cosmological approaches to organizing their own understanding of geographic space around some form of sacred or symbolically central point. Indigenous Australian Aboriginal geographic and cosmological tradition, already briefly touched upon in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy, in connection with Aboriginal celestial navigation, understood the land itself as having been shaped and created by ancestral beings during the dreaming. The wider Aboriginal cosmological framework already examined in that earlier episode, with specific geographic features across the Australian landscape, understood as physical traces of these same ancestral creative journeys, and Aboriginal songlines, extended oral and ceremonial traditions tracing these same ancestral pathways across enormous distances of the Australian continent, functioned as a genuinely sophisticated non-physical cartographic system, encoding detailed practical geographic and navigational knowledge, including the location of water sources and safe travel routes, within song, story, and ceremony, rather than within any physically drawn representation. A further genuinely significant example, alongside the Marshall Islander stick charts already discussed in this episode's first chapter, of cartographic knowledge existing and functioning perfectly well without ever taking the specific physical, drawn form that this episode's remaining chapters will primarily examine. The considerable diversity of ancient cosmological frameworks this whole chapter is examined, each reflecting its own particular civilization's specific religious, philosophical, and practical geographic concerns, illustrates a genuinely important point that this episode's remaining chapters will continue to explore, that a map was never, in any of the ancient or medieval traditions this whole episode examines, a simple, neutral, purely factual record of physical geography, but always also a genuine reflection of its own maker's deepest beliefs about the world's underlying structure, its own civilization's place within that structure, and the proper relationship between the known, familiar world and the vast, uncertain regions lying beyond it, a genuinely universal pattern that connects the Babylonian scribe's own centered Babylon to the Chinese cartographer's own Middle Kingdom, to the medieval European monk's own centered Jerusalem, each mapmaker, in their own particular way, quietly placing their own familiar world at the very heart of everything they knew. Ancient Greek geographic thought underwent a genuinely significant intellectual transformation across the several centuries this episode's chapter will examine, moving beyond the earlier mythological cosmology already introduced in this episode's second chapter toward an increasingly mathematical, increasingly empirically grounded approach to understanding and representing the Earth's actual physical shape and actual physical dimensions, a transformation substantially associated with the same broader Greek philosophical and scientific tradition already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy. Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek explorer and geographer working during the 4th century before the Common Era, undertook a genuinely remarkable voyage of exploration northward from the Mediterranean world into the North Atlantic, reaching, according to his own now lost original account preserved substantially through later ancient citation, a distant northern land he called Thule, likely corresponding to some part of Norway, Iceland, or the Shetland Islands, and Pytheas' own considerable first-hand observations regarding the far north's own genuinely unfamiliar phenomena, including the midnight sun and pack ice, though met with considerable skepticism from several of his own ancient contemporaries who simply could not credit such genuinely unfamiliar geographic claims, nonetheless represent one of the earliest documented examples of genuine ancient Greek geographic exploration, extending well beyond the Mediterranean world's own familiar boundaries. Hipparchus of Nicaea, already discussed extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy in connection with his considerable contributions to mathematical astronomy, also made genuinely significant contributions to the specific mathematical foundations of cartography, proposing a systematic coordinate system of latitude and longitude for locating specific places on the Earth's own curved surface, a genuinely foundational mathematical innovation that both Eratosthenes and, considerably later, Ptolemy would go on to further develop and further refine, illustrating once again, as this whole episode's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy has already demonstrated at considerable length, just how closely the ancient Greek astronomical and cartographic traditions developed alongside and in direct conversation with one another, since accurately locating a place on the Earth's own surface, and accurately locating a star in the night sky above required, as these same ancient Greek scholars quickly recognized, genuinely comparable underlying mathematical tools. Ptolemy's own geography survives today substantially through medieval Byzantine copies rather than any original ancient manuscript, and the considerable body of surviving Byzantine copies preserve not merely Ptolemy's own original coordinate tables, but also a genuinely rich later Byzantine tradition of actually drawing the maps these coordinates describe, since Ptolemy's own original text appears to have consisted substantially of written coordinate instructions rather than finished drawn maps, meaning that the visually familiar Ptolemaic world maps modern viewers typically encounter represent a later, if still genuinely faithful, Byzantine and Renaissance-era cartographic realization of Ptolemy's own considerably more abstract original mathematical instructions. The considerable Roman and Greek cartographic tradition this whole chapter has examined, spanning from Anaximander's own earliest circular world map through Ptolemy's own mathematically sophisticated coordinate system, and onward through the more purely practical Roman itinerary and road mapping traditions already discussed, together represent one of the single most enduringly influential bodies of cartographic achievement anywhere in the ancient world, a considerable inheritance that both the medieval Islamic cartographic tradition this episode's 5th chapter will examine, and the medieval European cartographic tradition this episode's 6th chapter will examine, would each, in their own particular way, go on to receive, study, and build further upon. Roman geographic administration extended its own considerable practical cartographic infrastructure into the specific field of milestone placement, with Roman authorities erecting carved stone markers at regular intervals along major roads, recording the precise distance to Rome itself or to other significant nearby administrative centers. A genuinely simple but genuinely practical form of distributed, physically embedded geographic information that required no separate physical map at all, since the road itself, marked at regular intervals, became a kind of continuous, physically walkable geographic reference system in its own right, a genuinely distinctive Roman practical solution to the same basic wayfinding challenge that this whole episode has examined so many different civilizations, addressing through so many genuinely different specific technical and cultural approaches. Anaximander of Miletus, working during the 6th century before the Common Era, and already briefly touched upon in this channel's earlier coverage of ancient astronomy in connection with early Greek natural philosophy, is credited by later ancient sources with producing one of the earliest Greek attempts at a systematic world map, depicting the known world as a circular disk surrounded by ocean, a cartographic effort that, whatever its own considerable geographic inaccuracy by any later standard, represents a genuinely significant early Greek attempt to render geographic knowledge in a systematic, visually organized form rather than through purely narrative or mythological description alone. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, already discussed extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of both the Library of Alexandria and ancient astronomy in connection with his celebrated calculation of the Earth's circumference, made genuinely foundational contributions to the specific field of mathematical cartography as well, compiling a systematic geographic treatise that attempted to map the known world according to a coordinate system of parallel lines, an early and genuinely significant precursor to the systematic latitude and longitude coordinate grid that later cartographers, this chapter's own later discussion of Claudius Ptolemy, will examine, would eventually develop into a considerably more mathematically rigorous and considerably more enduringly influential system. Claudius Ptolemy, working in Alexandria during the 2nd century of the Common Era, and already discussed extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of both the Library of Alexandria and ancient astronomy, in connection with his enormously influential astronomical treatise, the Almagest, produced a comparably foundational and comparably enduring cartographic work, the Geography, systematically compiling geographic coordinates for several thousand individual locations across the known ancient world, and providing detailed mathematical instructions for projecting the Earth's curved spherical surface onto a flat map, a genuinely sophisticated cartographic and mathematical achievement whose own considerable influence, like that of Ptolemy's astronomical work, would extend across both the medieval Islamic and medieval European cartographic traditions for well over 1,000 years following its original composition. Ptolemy's own considerable cartographic achievement was not without genuine and, in certain specific respects, genuinely consequential error, most significantly his own considerable underestimate of the Earth's actual circumference, an error that, transmitted faithfully across many subsequent centuries of cartographic tradition, would eventually play a genuinely direct role in Christopher Columbus's own 15th century calculations regarding the feasible distance of a westward Atlantic voyage to Asia, already discussed in this channel's own earlier coverage of the Silk Road, a genuinely striking example of how a single ancient mathematical error, however unintentional, could ripple forward across well over 1,000 years of subsequent cartographic and exploratory history before finally being corrected, a genuinely humbling reminder for any cartographer working in any century of just how much careful subsequent verification even the most celebrated and most enduringly authoritative ancient calculation genuinely requires. Roman cartographic practice developed along somewhat different and considerably more explicitly practical lines than the more theoretically oriented Greek geographic tradition already examined throughout this chapter, substantially oriented toward the genuinely practical administrative and military needs of governing and moving armies across the Roman Empire's own enormous territorial extent, with the Puttinger table, a later medieval copy of an original Roman road map, surviving today as a genuinely remarkable, if considerably distorted, elongated depiction of the entire Roman road network, stretching from Britain to India, illustrating the specifically practical, route-oriented character of Roman cartographic priorities, prioritizing accurate representation of road connections and travel distances over the kind of geographically precise proportional representation that more theoretically minded Greek cartographers, including Ptolemy, had prioritized in their own considerably more mathematically ambitious cartographic work. Strabo, a Greek geographer working during the late 1st century before and early 1st century of the Common Era, produced a genuinely monumental 17-volume geography compiling descriptive geographic knowledge of the entire known ancient world as understood from a broadly Roman imperial perspective, a work considerably less mathematically systematic than Ptolemy's own later coordinate-based geography already discussed in this chapter, but genuinely valuable to modern historians as a comprehensive surviving record of ancient geographic knowledge, opinion, and, in several documented cases, genuine ancient geographic misconception regarding the full breadth of the known ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Roman itinerary maps, a genuinely distinct practical cartographic genre standing alongside the more famous Puttinger table already discussed in this chapter, took the form of simple written lists of towns and distances along a specific route, functioning essentially as a purely textual, non-visual form of practical route mapping, and the considerable surviving body of these Roman itinerary documents, including the Antonine itinerary compiling routes across the entire Roman road network, provides modern historians with genuinely valuable practical evidence for the actual, lived experience of Roman travel, illustrating that ancient practical wayfinding did not always require a visual map at all, but could instead be successfully conducted through nothing more than a carefully memorized or carefully consulted written sequence of place names and distances, a genuinely practical ancient alternative to visual cartography that stands alongside the oral and memorized wayfinding traditions already examined in this episode's first chapter. Marinus of Tyre, a Greek geographer working shortly before Ptolemy during the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, whose own original geographic writing survives today only through Ptolemy's own extensive citation and, in several places, explicit critique, is credited by Ptolemy himself with developing several of the foundational mathematical and coordinate principles that Ptolemy's own considerably more famous and considerably better preserved geography would go on to more fully elaborate and more widely popularize, a genuinely significant reminder that even Ptolemy's own celebrated cartographic achievement rested substantially on the accumulated work of earlier scholars whose own original contributions have, in Marinus's own particular case, been almost entirely overshadowed by his more famous successor's own considerably greater surviving textual legacy. The Roman general and statesman Agrippa, working during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, is credited by several ancient sources with commissioning a genuinely monumental public world map displayed in Rome itself, drawing on considerable accumulated Roman military and administrative geographic knowledge gathered across the whole extent of Roman conquest and Roman diplomatic contact. And while the original physical map itself has not survived, several ancient authors who apparently viewed it directly preserved considerable descriptive detail regarding its content, providing modern historians with valuable indirect evidence for the scale and the considerable public prominence that at least some ancient Roman cartographic display achieved, a genuinely significant example of cartography functioning as public political and imperial statement, standing alongside its own more narrowly practical administrative and military functions already examined throughout this chapter. The Dura Europos shield map, a genuinely remarkable surviving fragment of a Roman military shield discovered at the ancient city of Dura Europos in modern Syria and bearing a painted schematic map depicting a stretch of the Black Sea coastline, provides modern historians with a genuinely rare surviving physical example of Roman military pictorial cartography, illustrating that Roman soldiers themselves at least in this one remarkable surviving instance, carried actual visual geographic representations into the field, alongside the more purely textual itinerary documents already discussed in this chapter, a genuinely valuable piece of physical evidence for the actual, practical diversity of Roman military cartographic practice. Roman surveying practice, supporting both the practical administration of newly conquered territory and the considerable Roman infrastructure projects already examined throughout this channel's own coverage of the Roman world, developed genuinely sophisticated practical surveying techniques and genuinely sophisticated surveying instruments, including the groma, a simple but genuinely effective sighting instrument used to establish straight lines and right angles across considerable distances, essential for the systematic centuriation land division surveys that Roman administrators conducted across newly settled territory, dividing conquered land into a regular, systematic grid of individual allotments in a practice whose own considerable physical traces remain genuinely visible in the field boundaries of several regions across the former Roman world even today, well over 1500 years after the Roman administrative surveys that originally established them. Chinese cartographic tradition developed, across many centuries of sustained practice, into one of the single most historically enduring and, in certain specific technical respects, one of the single most mathematically sophisticated cartographic traditions anywhere in the ancient and medieval world, substantially organized around a systematic rectangular grid coordinate system, whose own basic underlying principles bear a genuinely striking resemblance, despite arising from an entirely independent theoretical tradition, to the comparable coordinate-based approach that Eratosthenes and Ptolemy, already discussed extensively in this episode's third chapter, developed within the quite separate ancient Greek cartographic tradition. Chinese local administrative practice developed a genuinely distinctive and genuinely long-lived cartographic and documentary tradition known as the local gazetteer, systematic reference works compiled at the provincial and county level, combining maps with detailed written description of local geography, notable landmarks, administrative history, and prominent local individuals, a genre that developed continuously across many subsequent centuries of Chinese imperial administration, and that provided Chinese central government with genuinely valuable, genuinely systematic local geographic and administrative knowledge extending down to a level of local detail that few other ancient or medieval administrative traditions this whole episode examines managed to achieve with comparable consistency. Pei Xiu, working during the 3rd century of the Common Era and honored within Chinese cartographic history, with a title sometimes translated as the father of Chinese cartography, formalized what became the single most influential set of theoretical principles governing the whole subsequent development of Chinese cartographic practice, articulating 6 specific principles that a properly constructed map needed to satisfy, including the systematic use of a rectangular grid to ensure accurate proportional scale, correct representation of distances, and careful attention to the actual physical relief and terrain features of the mapped landscape, a genuinely systematic theoretical cartographic framework that would continue to inform Chinese map-making practice for well over 1,000 years following Pei Xiu's own original formulation. Chinese cartographic and navigational tradition benefited considerably from China's own early invention of the magnetic compass, originally developed for divination purposes before its own gradual practical adaptation to navigational and surveying use, and Chinese scholars, including the 11th century polymath Shen Kuo, made genuinely significant early observations regarding magnetic declination, the subtle but genuinely important difference between magnetic north and true geographic north, a genuinely sophisticated scientific observation that considerably predates comparable European recognition of the same phenomenon. And this same early Chinese compass technology would eventually, through the same considerable trade and cultural contact already examined extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of the Silk Road, reach the wider medieval Islamic and European world, where it would go on to play a genuinely essential role in the Portolan chart tradition this episode's 6th chapter has already examined, and in the whole subsequent European age of exploration this episode's 7th chapter will examine in considerably fuller detail. Shen Kuo's own considerable scientific and cartographic achievements extended well beyond his compass observations already discussed in this chapter. since he is also credited with an early and genuinely sophisticated conception of relief mapping, constructing three-dimensional terrain models from materials including wax and sawdust to more accurately represent mountainous terrain than a purely flat, two-dimensional map could ever adequately convey. A genuinely inventive, practical cartographic solution to a genuine representational problem that would not be systematically addressed within the European cartographic tradition through comparable relief modeling techniques for several subsequent centuries. The earliest surviving physical examples of Chinese grid-based cartography considerably predate Peishu's own formal theoretical codification, with archaeologists recovering silk maps from a tomb dated to the 2nd century before the Common Era, depicting a specific southern Chinese region with genuinely remarkable topographical and administrative detail, including accurately proportioned river systems and settlement locations, physical evidence that the underlying practical Chinese cartographic techniques Peishu would later formally theorize had already been developing in genuine practical use for several centuries before his own influential written formulation of their underlying governing principles. Chinese cartographic production benefited considerably from China's own early development of paper and, eventually, printing technology, already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of the Silk Road, since these same technologies allowed Chinese maps to be reproduced and distributed with a degree of consistency and a degree of wide practical availability that considerably exceeded what hand-copied maps produced within several other ancient and medieval cartographic traditions could typically achieve, and the surviving UG2, or Map of the Tracks of Yu, carved into stone in the year 1137, and depicting China's own river systems and coastline according to a carefully maintained rectangular grid, represents one of the single most impressive surviving examples of pre-modern Chinese cartographic precision anywhere in the world, its own considerable geographic accuracy genuinely impressing modern historians of cartography who have studied it. The Gangnedo map, produced in Korea in 1402, and drawing substantially on earlier Chinese cartographic sources, alongside additional Korean and, remarkably, Islamic geographic information that had reached Korea through the same wider Mongol-era Eurasian trade and diplomatic connections already examined extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of the Silk Road, represents one of the single most geographically comprehensive East Asian world maps produced anywhere before the era of direct European contact, depicting not merely China and Korea, but a recognizable, if considerably distorted, outline of the wider Eurasian landmass extending as far as Europe and Africa, a genuinely striking testament to just how far geographic knowledge had already traveled across the Mongol-connected Eurasian world by this particular historical period, considerably predating any direct Korean or Chinese contact with Europe itself. Japanese cartographic tradition, developing substantially under Chinese cultural and technical influence already examined extensively throughout this chapter, nonetheless produced its own genuinely distinctive regional cartographic style, including the Jogi-style maps named for an 8th century Buddhist monk, and depicting Japan's own characteristic elongated island geography in a schematic, stylized form that would remain broadly recognizable and broadly influential across many subsequent centuries of Japanese cartographic production, and Japanese mapmakers, like their Chinese counterparts already examined throughout this chapter, maintained a genuinely sophisticated administrative cartographic tradition, supporting the practical governance of Japan's own considerable feudal territorial structure across many centuries of continued Japanese political development. Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian cartographic traditions, developing within the wider cultural sphere already examined in connection with both Chinese and Indian civilizational influence throughout this chapter, produced their own genuinely distinctive regional cartographic achievements, including surviving Vietnamese administrative maps documenting territorial expansion and territorial governance across many centuries of continued Vietnamese dynastic rule, a further genuinely significant regional cartographic tradition standing alongside the more extensively studied Chinese, Korean, and Japanese traditions already examined throughout this chapter, and reflecting the same wider East and Southeast Asian pattern of grid-based, administratively oriented cartographic practice that this whole chapter has traced back to Peishu's own foundational 3rd century theoretical framework. The considerable East Asian cartographic tradition this whole chapter has examined, From Pei Shu's own foundational grid theory through the practical achievements of Zhang Heng, Shen Kuo, Zheng He, and the wider Korean and Japanese traditions this chapter is also traced, together represent one of the single most mathematically sophisticated and one of the single most institutionally sustained cartographic traditions anywhere in the pre-modern world, a tradition whose own considerable achievements this episode's remaining chapters will now set alongside the comparably rich and comparably sophisticated medieval Islamic and medieval European cartographic traditions still to be examined. The considerable Chinese cartographic tradition's own genuine intellectual and technical continuity across so many centuries, from the 2nd century before the Common Era silk maps already discussed in this chapter, through Pei Shu's 3rd century theoretical codification, the 11th century stone-carved Yuji-2, and the considerable Yuan and later Ming dynasty cartographic achievements this chapter has already examined, represents one of the single longest continuously documented and continuously developing cartographic traditions anywhere in the whole ancient and medieval world, a genuinely remarkable record of sustained institutional and intellectual continuity that few other cartographic traditions this whole episode examines can genuinely match in terms of sheer unbroken chronological duration. Chinese cartographic tradition maintained, across many centuries of continued practice, a genuinely distinctive administrative and bureaucratic orientation, with Chinese maps frequently produced and maintained as genuinely practical instruments of imperial governance, recording provincial boundaries, tax districts, and transportation infrastructure in considerable systematic detail, a genuinely practical administrative cartographic function that parallels, in its own basic underlying purpose, if not in its own specific technical execution, the comparable practical administrative cartography already examined in this episode's 3rd chapter in connection with Roman surveying and Roman road mapping. Zhang Heng, a Chinese polymath working during the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, whose own considerable scientific achievements included the invention of an early seismoscope, capable of detecting the direction of distant earthquakes, also made genuinely significant contributions to Chinese cartographic and geographic scholarship, and the broader Chinese scientific and administrative tradition of careful, systematic geographic and astronomical observation that produced figures including Zhang Heng, reflects the same wider Chinese intellectual pattern already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient astronomy, in which sustained imperial court patronage supported many centuries of continuous, carefully documented scientific and geographic observation. The Mongol Yuan dynasty's own considerable administrative unification of China during the 13th and 14th centuries, already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of the Silk Road in connection with the wider Pax Mongolica, produced renewed Chinese cartographic investment and renewed Chinese cartographic ambition, with Yuan dynasty administrators commissioning updated maps reflecting the Mongol Empire's own enormous transcontinental territorial extent, incorporating, for the first time in systematic Chinese cartographic practice, considerable new geographic information regarding Central Asia, Persia, and even parts of Europe that direct Mongol administrative and trade contact, already examined extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of the Silk Road, had made newly accessible to Chinese scholarly and administrative attention. The Chinese Admiral Zheng He's own celebrated early 15th century series of massive maritime expeditions, extending Chinese naval and diplomatic reach across Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and the eastern coast of Africa, generated considerable new Chinese cartographic and navigational knowledge regarding these distant maritime regions, documented in surviving Chinese navigational charts and sailing directions that, while considerably less well preserved and considerably less widely studied by modern Western historians of cartography than the roughly contemporary European exploratory cartography this episode's 7th chapter will examine, nonetheless represent a genuinely significant and, for many decades, genuinely underappreciated body of pre-modern Chinese maritime geographic achievement. Chinese cartographic tradition maintained a genuinely distinctive artistic and aesthetic sensibility that considerably distinguished it from the more purely mathematical and coordinate-focused Greek and Roman cartographic traditions this episode's 3rd chapter has already examined, with many surviving Chinese maps incorporating genuinely sophisticated landscape painting techniques, depicting mountains, rivers, and other terrain features with a degree of artistic elaboration that blended practical geographic information with genuine aesthetic and, in certain specific cases, genuinely poetic sensibility, reflecting the wider Chinese cultural tradition's own considerable integration of practical and aesthetic concerns across numerous different fields of intellectual and artistic production. Following the rapid 7th and 8th century Arab conquests already discussed extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of both the Silk Road and ancient astronomy, Islamic scholars inherited and, over the following centuries, substantially expanded upon the accumulated geographic and cartographic knowledge of the ancient Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions that fell within this new political and cultural sphere. A translation and scholarly expansion movement, centered substantially on the same house of wisdom in Baghdad, already examined extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of ancient astronomy and ancient medicine, where scholars translated Ptolemy's geography, already discussed extensively in this episode's 3rd chapter, into Arabic, beginning a centuries-long tradition of Islamic cartographic scholarship that considerably refined, corrected, and in several important respects genuinely extended beyond the inherited ancient geographic framework. The Caliph al-Ma'mun, already briefly mentioned in this chapter's discussion of the degree measurement expedition, sponsored a genuinely ambitious collaborative cartographic project, bringing together a team of astronomers and geographers specifically tasked with producing an updated and corrected world map, surpassing Ptolemy's own inherited ancient framework, a project whose own original physical map has unfortunately not survived to the present day, but whose considerable underlying scholarly achievement is documented extensively in the surviving written geographic works of scholars who participated in or drew upon this same collaborative effort, a genuinely significant example of the kind of large-scale, institutionally sponsored collaborative scientific project that this channel's own earlier coverage of Islamic astronomy has already examined in connection with the major medieval Islamic observatories. Ibn Khordadbeh, working during the 9th century as a postal and intelligence official within the Abbasid Caliphate's own considerable administrative bureaucracy, composed one of the earliest surviving examples of the Kitab al-Masalik geographic genre, already briefly touched upon elsewhere in this chapter, drawing directly on his own official access to the considerable geographic and logistical information that the Caliphate's own postal and courier network generated in the ordinary course of its administrative operation, a genuinely direct and genuinely practical example of how medieval Islamic administrative infrastructure itself, quite apart from any purely scholarly or purely religious motivation, generated genuinely valuable raw geographic data that scholars, including Ibn Khordadbeh, could then systematically compile into a more broadly useful geographic reference work. Al-Khwarizmi, the 9th century Persian mathematician already known to many modern readers as the namesake of the mathematical term algorithm, produced a genuinely significant early Islamic geographic treatise correcting several specific errors in Ptolemy's own inherited coordinate data, reflecting the same genuinely careful, systematically critical scholarly engagement with inherited ancient knowledge that this channel's own earlier coverage of Islamic astronomy has already examined in considerable further detail, and al-Khwarizmi's own considerable mathematical expertise, already well established through his own foundational contributions to algebra, brought genuinely rigorous mathematical precision to his own cartographic and geographic scholarly work. Muhammad al-Idrisi, working during the 12th century at the court of the Norman king Roger II of Sicily, a genuinely striking example of cross-cultural intellectual patronage given Roger's own Christian European royal identity, actively sponsoring Islamic scholarly cartographic work, produced what many modern historians of cartography consider the single most sophisticated and single most geographically comprehensive world map produced anywhere in the medieval world, known as the Tabula Rogeriana, compiled through al-Idrisi's own careful systematic synthesis of Islamic geographic scholarship, direct testimony gathered from travelling merchants and sailors, and Roger's own considerable royal patronage, supporting years of dedicated research, resulting in a genuinely remarkable cartographic achievement, whose own considerable geographic accuracy across Europe, North Africa, and Asia alike would not be matched by European cartography for several subsequent centuries. Medieval Islamic scholars extended their own considerable cartographic and mathematical expertise into the specific field of celestial globe and terrestrial globe construction, producing genuinely sophisticated three-dimensional geographic representations alongside the more common flat maps this chapter has primarily examined, and surviving medieval Islamic terrestrial globes, though considerably rarer than surviving flat maps given their own greater cost and greater technical difficulty to construct, demonstrate that medieval Islamic cartographers, like the ancient Greek geographers already discussed in this episode's third chapter, maintained a genuine and sophisticated understanding of the Earth's actual spherical shape, choosing the flat map format primarily for its own considerable practical convenience, rather than from any underlying belief that the Earth was not, in physical reality, a sphere. Al-Idrisi's own considerable cartographic achievement extended beyond the single large world map already discussed in this chapter, encompassing a genuinely extensive written geographic treatise accompanying his cartographic work, describing in considerable systematic detail the specific climate, resources, culture, and notable features of numerous individual regions across the known medieval world. A genuinely comprehensive medieval geographic reference work that, alongside the map itself, represents one of the single most significant achievements of the whole medieval Islamic cartographic tradition this chapter examines. Ibn Battuta, a 14th century Islamic scholar and traveller whose own remarkable decades-long journey across virtually the entire breadth of the medieval Islamic world, and considerably beyond, extending from Morocco to China, generated a genuinely enormous body of first-hand descriptive geographic knowledge, documented in his own extensive travel account, the Rihla, a work that, while not itself a cartographic document in the sense this whole episode primarily examines, provided medieval Islamic geographers with an enormously valuable body of direct eyewitness geographic testimony regarding regions considerably beyond the more immediately accessible core of the medieval Islamic world, a genuinely significant contribution to the wider medieval Islamic geographic tradition, standing alongside the more narrowly cartographic achievements this chapter has primarily examined. The wider medieval Islamic geographic literary tradition, encompassing a genre Arabic scholars called Kitab al-Masalik wa al-Mamalik, literally books of routes and kingdoms, produced a considerable body of systematic descriptive geographic writing across many centuries, cataloguing trade routes, regional resources, and cultural and political information regarding the numerous kingdoms and regions within and beyond the medieval Islamic world's own considerable territorial extent, a genuinely significant complementary tradition to the more purely visual cartographic achievement this chapter has primarily examined, reflecting the same genuine medieval Islamic scholarly commitment to systematic, comprehensive geographic knowledge that this whole chapter has traced across numerous specific individual scholars and specific individual cartographic achievements. Islamic cartographic tradition developed its own genuinely distinctive regional variant, specifically serving Islamic religious practice, with specialized maps and specialized mathematical tables developed specifically to help determine the precise direction of Mecca, the Qibla already discussed in this channel's own earlier coverage of Islamic astronomy, from any given location across the vast geographic extent of the medieval Islamic world, a genuinely practical religious cartographic application that provided sustained institutional and religious motivation for continued Islamic geographic and mathematical scholarship across many centuries in a pattern genuinely comparable to the sustained religious motivation already examined throughout this channel's own coverage of Islamic astronomy's own close connection to practical religious timekeeping and prayer direction calculation. Medieval Islamic astronomers and geographers, drawing on the same considerable observational and mathematical tradition already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of Islamic astronomy, undertook genuinely significant efforts to independently verify and, where necessary, correct the Earth's actual measured circumference and actual measured geographic coordinates, with a team of astronomers working under the 9th century Caliph al-Ma'mun, reportedly conducting a fresh degree measurement expedition across the Mesopotamian desert, specifically intended to verify Eratosthenes' own ancient Greek calculation, already discussed extensively in this episode's third chapter, arriving at a result genuinely close to the modern accepted value, and illustrating the same kind of careful, empirically grounded scientific methodology that this channel's own earlier coverage of Islamic astronomy has already examined at considerable length. Medieval Islamic cartographers also produced a genuinely distinctive circular map tradition, associated with the bulky school of geographers active from the 10th century onward, and producing a systematic series of regional maps covering the entire Islamic world, organized according to a consistent, somewhat schematic circular and geometric visual style, prioritizing clarity and administrative usefulness over strict proportional geographic accuracy. A genuinely significant medieval Islamic cartographic subtradition, standing alongside the more famous and more geographically ambitious achievement of al-Idrisi, already examined at length in this chapter, illustrating that medieval Islamic cartography, like the wider Chinese cartographic tradition this episode's 4th chapter has already examined, encompassed genuine internal stylistic diversity rather than any single uniform approach. Medieval Islamic scholarly geography maintained a genuinely close and genuinely productive relationship with the wider medieval Islamic astronomical tradition, already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of Islamic astronomy, since the same astronomers working at major observatories including Mariga and Samarkand, already discussed in that same earlier episode, frequently also produced significant geographic and cartographic scholarship, applying the same careful mathematical and observational rigor to terrestrial geography that they simultaneously applied to their own celestial observations. A genuinely close intellectual partnership between the ancient astronomy and cartography, this whole episode has repeatedly noted, extends with particular clarity into this specific medieval Islamic scholarly context. The considerable medieval Islamic cartographic tradition this whole chapter is examined, from al-Khwarizmi's own early corrections to Ptolemy, through al-Idrisi's own remarkable Sicilian world map, and onward through the bulky school's own distinctive regional maps, and Ibn Khordadbeh's own administratively grounded geographic writing, together represent a genuinely sophisticated and genuinely sustained scholarly achievement that considerably shaped the whole subsequent medieval European cartographic tradition. This episode's 6th chapter will now examine in turn, since medieval European scholars, as this whole episode has already noted on several occasions, drew directly and considerably on this same accumulated medieval Islamic geographic scholarship, as their own European cartographic tradition gradually developed and gradually matured across the following centuries. The Piri Reis map, a remarkable early 16th century Ottoman Turkish nautical chart compiled by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, and famously depicting portions of the recently explored Atlantic and American coastlines with a degree of detail that has generated considerable modern, popular speculation and, in several cases, genuinely unfounded pseudo-historical theorizing regarding its possible sources, represents in genuine historical fact a careful compilation drawing on numerous earlier Islamic, Portuguese, and Spanish source maps that Piri Reis himself explicitly credited in his own surviving accompanying notes. A genuinely significant late example of the same continued Islamic cartographic tradition this whole chapter has examined, actively incorporating and synthesizing the newest available geographic information from the recently begun European age of exploration. This episode's 7th chapter will examine in considerably fuller detail. Islamic geographic and cartographic scholarship maintain genuinely close practical connections to the considerable trade networks already examined extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of the Silk Road, since accurate geographic knowledge of distant trading regions represented genuinely valuable practical commercial information for Islamic merchants operating across the enormous geographic breadth of medieval Islamic trade connections, a practical commercial motivation for sustained geographic scholarship that, alongside the religious motivations already discussed in this chapter, helped sustain the considerable institutional and scholarly investment that produced the genuinely impressive body of medieval Islamic cartographic achievement this whole chapter has examined. Medieval European cartography, across the centuries following the fall of Rome's Western Empire, already discussed extensively throughout this channel's own coverage of Roman Britain and Byzantium, developed substantially through the same monastic institutional channels already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of medieval monasticism, since medieval European monasteries frequently maintained the scriptoria and the considerable accumulated geographic manuscript knowledge that shaped the specific character of medieval European mappae mundi, literally maps of the world, the distinctive genre of medieval European world maps this chapter primarily examines. Medieval mappae mundi differed genuinely and substantially from the more purely navigationally practical cartographic traditions this episode's other chapters examine, since these medieval Christian European world maps served substantially religious, educational, and symbolic purposes rather than any genuinely practical wayfinding function, typically organized according to the TO map format already briefly touched upon in this episode's second chapter, depicting the three known continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa arranged around a central Mediterranean Sea and eastern Jerusalem, oriented with east rather than the modern conventional north, positioned at the top of the map, reflecting the Latin word oriens, meaning east, from which the modern English word orientation itself ultimately derives. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, produced in England during the late 13th century and surviving today as the single largest and single most elaborately detailed medieval world map still in existence, illustrates the genuinely rich and genuinely encyclopedic character of the wider medieval Mappae Mundi tradition, incorporating not merely geographic information, but an enormous wealth of additional biblical, historical, mythological, and natural historical content, including depictions of biblical events, classical mythological creatures, and various legendary and semi-legendary distant peoples believed to inhabit the world's more remote and less thoroughly explored regions. A genuinely comprehensive medieval visual encyclopedia of contemporary geographic and cultural knowledge, rather than any narrowly practical navigational tool. The Psalter World Map, a considerably smaller 13th century English Mappa Mundi, surviving bound within an illuminated Psalter manuscript, and depicting Christ presiding over the whole known world from above, represents a further genuinely significant surviving example of the wider medieval Mappae Mundi tradition, already examined throughout this chapter, its own considerably more compact scale reflecting its own practical function as a devotional object intended for private prayer and contemplation, rather than the kind of large-scale public display that a map the size of the Hereford or Ebstorf examples already discussed in this chapter would have required, illustrating that medieval religious cartography operated across a genuinely wide range of physical scales and a genuinely wide range of specific devotional and educational functions, from enormous public wall displays to small intimate objects of private prayer. The considerable body of medieval European itinerary maps produced by the 13th century English monk Matthew Paris represents a further genuinely distinctive medieval English cartographic contribution, depicting a specific practical pilgrimage route from London to Jerusalem across a series of connected strip map panels, rather than any single unified geographic representation, a genuinely practical medieval cartographic format specifically designed to guide an actual travelling pilgrim step by step along a specific known route, standing in genuine contrast to the more purely symbolic and purely encyclopedic Mappae Mundi tradition this chapter has primarily examined, and illustrating that medieval European Christian cartography, much like the wider medieval Islamic and Chinese cartographic traditions already examined throughout this whole episode, actually encompassed a genuinely wide range of distinct formats, each serving its own specific practical or devotional purpose. Medieval European Jewish cartographic and geographic scholarship, produced within Jewish scholarly communities scattered across medieval Christian Europe and the wider medieval Mediterranean world alike, made genuinely significant contributions to medieval cartography that extended well beyond the specific Catalan atlas already discussed in this chapter, with Jewish scholars drawing on their own considerable multilingual capability spanning Hebrew, Arabic, and the various local European vernacular languages of their own scattered medieval communities, frequently serving as genuinely valuable intellectual intermediaries transmitting geographic and astronomical knowledge between the medieval Islamic and medieval Christian European scholarly worlds, a further genuinely significant thread within the wider tapestry of medieval cross-cultural cartographic exchange this whole episode has traced throughout its many preceding chapters. The considerable medieval European cartographic tradition this whole chapter has examined, spanning the enormous symbolic ambition of the Hereford and Ebstorf Mappae Mundi through the more purely practical Portolan chart and Goaf map traditions, and onward through the genuinely rich hybrid achievement of the Catalan Atlas, together represent a genuinely diverse and genuinely sophisticated body of medieval cartographic achievement that, however much it has sometimes been unfairly overshadowed in popular historical memory by the more famous cartographic developments of the subsequent age of exploration, this episode's 7th chapter we'll now examine deserves to be remembered as a genuinely serious and genuinely significant chapter in its own right within the whole long history of world cartography this entire episode has traced. The Gough Map, an English map dating to sometime in the mid to late 14th century and named for the 18th century antiquarian who later acquired it, represents a genuinely significant and genuinely distinctive medieval English cartographic achievement, standing somewhat apart from the more symbolically oriented mappae mundi already examined throughout this chapter, depicting the island of Britain with a degree of practical geographic accuracy and a genuinely dense network of marked roads that suggests a considerably more practically navigational purpose than the more purely religious and educational mappae mundi tradition this chapter has primarily examined. A genuinely valuable surviving example of medieval English practical geographic knowledge, standing alongside the more famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, already discussed in this same chapter. The Ebstorf Map, another major surviving medieval Mappa Mundi produced in Germany during the 13th century, though tragically destroyed during Allied bombing in the Second World War, and now known to modern scholars only through earlier photographic documentation, presented a genuinely striking and genuinely distinctive theological cartographic conception, depicting the entire known world as, quite literally, the body of Christ, with Christ's head, hands, and feet positioned at the map's outer edges, a genuinely remarkable example of how thoroughly medieval European Christian theological conviction could shape the fundamental visual and conceptual organization of an entire cartographic tradition. The Catalan Atlas, produced around 1375 by Jewish cartographers working in Majorca and combining the practical navigational accuracy of the Portolan chart tradition already discussed in this chapter with the rich decorative and encyclopedic content more typically associated with a mappae mundi tradition, represents a genuinely significant hybrid medieval cartographic achievement, incorporating detailed and, for its own period, genuinely accurate geographic information regarding North Africa and the Mediterranean world drawn substantially from contemporary Jewish and Islamic trading networks, alongside considerable illustrated content depicting rulers, caravans, and notable geographic features across the known world. A genuinely rich surviving example of exactly the kind of practical symbolic cartographic hybrid that this whole episode has repeatedly observed emerging wherever different medieval cartographic traditions and different medieval cultural communities came into sustained productive contact with one another. Medieval European monastic scriptoria, already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of medieval monasticism, maintained a genuinely significant role in the physical production and physical preservation of mappae mundi manuscripts, since the careful, painstaking work of copying and illuminating a complex mappa mundi manuscript, involving considerable skilled scribal and artistic labor comparable to the illuminated manuscript production already examined extensively in that same earlier episode, required exactly the kind of sustained, well-resourced institutional support that medieval monasteries were uniquely positioned to provide, meaning that the whole surviving mappae mundi tradition this chapter has examined owes a genuinely direct institutional debt to the same medieval monastic manuscript culture already examined throughout this channel's own coverage of medieval monastic daily life. The considerable medieval European scholarly debate regarding the Earth's actual shape, contrary to a genuinely persistent and genuinely inaccurate modern popular misconception holding that medieval Europeans widely believed the Earth was flat, actually maintained among genuinely educated medieval scholars a broad continuous consensus regarding the Earth's spherical shape, inherited directly from the ancient Greek geographic tradition already examined extensively in this episode's 3rd chapter, and preserved through the same medieval monastic and scholarly channels already examined throughout this whole episode, meaning that the schematic, symbolically organized appearance of medieval mappae mundi reflects their own distinctive religious and educational purpose, rather than any genuine underlying medieval belief in a literally flat Earth. The Betis Maps, a distinctive series of medieval mappae mundi, originating from illustrated manuscript copies of an 8th century Spanish monk named Betis of Liébana's own commentary on the biblical Book of Revelation, represent a genuinely significant sub-tradition within the wider medieval mappae mundi genre, produced across many subsequent centuries of continued monastic manuscript copying and illustration, and these considerable surviving Betis map manuscripts, several dozen of which survive today in various European libraries and archives, provide modern historians of cartography with valuable comparative evidence for how this same basic medieval religious cartographic tradition evolved and varied across many centuries of continued monastic reproduction and continued monastic artistic reinterpretation. The so-called Vinland Map, a considerably more recently surfaced document purporting to be a genuine 15th century map depicting a North Atlantic landmass labelled Vinland and apparently confirming pre-Columbian Norse knowledge of North America, generated genuine and considerable scholarly excitement following its public unveiling in 1965. But subsequent careful modern scientific analysis, including chemical analysis of its ink composition, has established with genuine and considerable confidence that the document is, in fact, a modern forgery rather than an authentic medieval artifact, a genuinely instructive cautionary episode in the wider modern scholarly study of historical cartography that illustrates just how carefully and just how rigorously modern historians must verify the genuine authenticity of any purported historical map before drawing significant historical conclusions from it, particularly given how much popular fascination and how much popular financial value can attach itself to a sufficiently dramatic and sufficiently historically significant purported discovery. Medieval European practical navigational cartography, developed along somewhat separate lines from the more symbolically oriented mappae mundi already examined throughout this chapter, with the emergence, during the 13th century, of Portolan charts, genuinely practical maritime navigational charts depicting coastlines and harbours with considerable geographic accuracy, organised around a network of rum lines indicating compass bearings between major ports, a genuinely significant medieval European cartographic innovation whose own considerable practical navigational accuracy developed substantially through the direct accumulated observational experience of working Mediterranean sailors, rather than through any inherited ancient theoretical framework, represents a genuinely important and genuinely distinct medieval European cartographic achievement. Standing alongside the more symbolically oriented mappae mundi, this chapter has primarily examined the gradual medieval European rediscovery and gradual medieval European translation of Ptolemy's own ancient geography, already discussed extensively in this episode's third chapter, reaching Western Europe substantially during the early 15th century through Byzantine Greek scholarly channels already examined in this channel's own earlier coverage of Byzantium's own final centuries, provided medieval European cartographers with renewed access to Ptolemy's own considerable mathematical coordinate system and considerable mathematical projection methodology, a genuinely significant scholarly rediscovery that would directly and substantially inform the subsequent European cartographic achievements this episode's 7th chapter will examine in considerably fuller detail. The considerable European maritime exploration already briefly touched upon in this channel's own earlier coverage of the Silk Road's own gradual overland decline generated an enormous and genuinely unprecedented wave of new geographic information that European cartographers working across the late 15th and 16th centuries needed to somehow systematically incorporate into their own inherited and, by this point, genuinely outdated cartographic frameworks, a genuinely significant cartographic challenge that this whole chapter will examine as one of the single most historically consequential periods in the entire history of world cartography. Prince Henry of Portugal, remembered in later historical tradition as Henry the Navigator, despite apparently never personally undertaking any of the exploratory voyages he so extensively sponsored, established during the 15th century a genuinely significant Royal Portuguese institutional program supporting sustained systematic maritime exploration down the western coast of Africa, sponsoring the training of navigators, the construction of specialized exploratory vessels, and the careful accumulation and careful cartographic recording of the geographic knowledge these same voyages steadily produced. A genuinely significant institutional precedent for exactly the kind of sustained, systematically organized royal exploratory and cartographic investment that would eventually enable the considerably more famous voyages of Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan already examined throughout this chapter. The considerable technical development of the caravel, a genuinely significant Portuguese sailing vessel design, combining greater maneuverability and greater capacity for sailing against the wind than earlier European ship designs had generally achieved, directly enabled the sustained systematic exploration that Prince Henry's own institutional programme, already discussed in this chapter, required. A genuinely important reminder that the whole considerable European age of exploration this chapter has primarily examined depended not merely on improved cartographic and navigational knowledge, but on genuinely significant parallel advances in maritime shipbuilding technology, without which the accumulated geographic and navigational knowledge this whole episode has traced could never have actually been put into practical exploratory use. The considerable European cartographic industry that developed across the 16th and 17th centuries, centered substantially in the prosperous trading cities of the Low Countries already discussed in this chapter, also produced genuinely significant advances in the specific technical craft of map printing and map engraving, with the copper plate engraving techniques that Dutch and Flemish print workshops developed and refined, allowing for considerably finer, considerably more detailed, and considerably more widely reproducible printed maps than the earlier woodblock printing techniques this whole episode has occasionally touched upon in connection with Chinese and, considerably later, early European printed map production had generally allowed a genuinely significant technical printing innovation supporting the wider commercial cartographic publishing boom already examined in this chapter's discussion of Ortelius and his own considerable atlas publishing success. Ferdinand Magellan's own celebrated early 16th century expedition, though Magellan himself died partway through the voyage in the Philippines, achieved the first complete circumnavigation of the globe under the eventual command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, providing European cartographers with the single most direct and single most conclusive practical confirmation of the Earth's actual spherical shape and actual total circumference that any expedition had yet achieved, correcting through genuinely direct practical demonstration rather than any purely theoretical calculation several of the more significant remaining geographic uncertainties that had continued to trouble European cartographers even after Columbus's own earlier voyages had already forced considerable revision of the inherited Ptolemaic geographic framework. Christopher Columbus's own westward Atlantic voyage in 1492, already discussed extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of the Silk Road in connection with Marco Polo's own influence on Columbus's geographic thinking, and already discussed in this episode's third chapter in connection with Ptolemy's own considerable underestimate of the Earth's actual circumference, produced an entirely unanticipated cartographic crisis for European mapmakers, since the landmass Columbus had actually encountered fit nowhere within the existing inherited Ptolemaic geographic framework, requiring European cartographers to gradually, and often quite reluctantly, revise their own inherited assumptions regarding the world's actual total geographic extent. Juan de la Cosa, a Spanish cartographer and navigator who had personally sailed alongside Columbus on his own earlier voyages, produced in 1500 what survives today as the earliest known European map depicting any portion of the Americas based on genuine direct first-hand exploration rather than second-hand report or theoretical extrapolation, a genuinely significant early cartographic milestone that illustrates just how rapidly European cartographers began incorporating new geographic information following Columbus's own initial voyages, even as the wider European cartographic community, as this chapter has already discussed, continued to work through the considerable theoretical confusion that these same new geographic discoveries had initially generated. The Portuguese and Spanish crown's own considerable rivalry over newly claimed overseas territory produced, in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas, a genuinely significant diplomatic and cartographic agreement, drawing a single line of longitude across the Atlantic Ocean specifically intended to divide future territorial claims between the two competing Iberian powers, a genuinely direct and genuinely consequential example of how cartographic lines, however abstract and however imperfectly informed by the actual geographic knowledge available at the time this particular treaty line was drawn, could carry enormous genuine political, economic, and, for the indigenous peoples whose own territory this same treaty line carved up without their own knowledge or consent, genuinely devastating human consequence. European cartographers own considerable practical difficulty in accurately determining longitude, standing in genuine contrast to the comparably straightforward practical determination of latitude through simple celestial observation, already examined extensively throughout this whole episode's coverage of ancient astronomy, represented a genuinely persistent and genuinely consequential navigational and cartographic problem, extending well beyond this particular episode's own primary historical focus, a problem that would not find a genuinely reliable practical solution until the 18th century development of sufficiently accurate mechanical marine chronometers, a considerably later chapter in the whole long history of cartography and navigation that lies beyond this particular episode's own primary ancient and medieval scope, but that represents a direct continuation of exactly the same fundamental practical challenge, knowing precisely where one actually is. That has motivated every single cartographic tradition this whole episode has examined. The considerable European age of exploration this whole chapter is examined, from Columbus's own accidental encounter with an entire unanticipated continent, through Magellan's own conclusive circumnavigation, and onward through the considerable commercial cartographic industry that Mercator and Ortelius helped establish, together represent the single most rapid and single most consequential period of cartographic transformation in the whole long history this entire episode has traced, compressing into barely a century a degree of genuine geographic revision and genuine geographic completion that considerably exceeded everything the preceding several thousand years of human cartographic effort, examined across this episode's own preceding 6 chapters, had managed to achieve. Martin Waldseemüller, a German cartographer working in the early 16th century, produced in 1507 a genuinely historically significant world map that represents the first known cartographic use of the name America to label the newly encountered western landmass, a naming choice honouring the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose own published accounts of voyages to the new continent had argued with genuine intellectual boldness for its own time that this newly encountered land represented an entirely separate landmass, distinct from Asia, rather than merely an outlying extension of the already known Asian continent that Columbus himself had continued to insist he had actually reached. The Spanish and Portuguese royal courts, deeply invested in the enormous commercial and strategic value that accurate geographic knowledge of newly explored territory represented, maintained closely guarded official master maps, most notably the Spanish Padrón Real, a continuously updated official master chart maintained under royal authority in Seville, and incorporating the latest geographic information returning with each successive exploratory voyage, with cartographers including the Portuguese-born Diogo Ribeiro serving as official royal cosmographer, specifically responsible for maintaining and updating this genuinely valuable strategic document, a degree of royal cartographic secrecy and royal cartographic control that reflects just how seriously European monarchies had come to understand accurate geographic knowledge as a genuine matter of considerable strategic and commercial advantage, worth protecting from rival European powers through careful official secrecy. Amerigo Vespucci's own published accounts of his voyages to the recently encountered western landmass, already briefly discussed in this chapter in connection with Waldseemüller's own naming decision, proved genuinely influential substantially because Vespucci himself, unlike several of his more geographically confused contemporaries including Columbus, correctly and quite boldly argued that the newly encountered lands represented an entirely separate continental landmass rather than merely an outlying part of Asia, a genuinely significant geographic insight that Waldseemüller's own influential 1507 map decision to honour with the name America helped permanently cement into the whole subsequent European and eventually global geographic and cartographic vocabulary. Gerardus Mercator, working during the 16th century in the Low Countries, produced in 1569 what remains, even today, one of the single most historically significant and single most enduringly influential cartographic innovations in the whole history of world mapmaking, a mathematical map projection specifically designed to preserve accurate compass-bearing angles across the map's entire surface, a genuinely invaluable practical navigational tool for sailors needing to plot a straight compass course across open ocean, even though this same Mercator projection necessarily distorts the relative size of land masses, particularly at higher latitudes, a well-known cartographic trade-off that continues to generate genuine modern popular discussion, and, in certain contexts, genuine modern controversy regarding the political and cultural implications of this same enormously influential and still widely used map projection. The considerable European cartographic industry that developed across the 16th and 17th centuries centered substantially in the prosperous trading cities of the Low Countries, including Antwerp and Amsterdam, produced an increasingly commercialized and increasingly systematically organized cartographic publishing tradition, with figures including Abraham Ortelius, whose own 1570 publication Theatrum Orbis Terrarum represents what many historians of cartography consider the world's first true modern atlas, a systematically organized, uniformly formatted collection of maps covering the whole known world, a genuinely significant publishing and organizational innovation that established the basic format that atlases would continue to follow for centuries afterward. The considerable new geographic information that European exploration continued to generate across the following centuries required repeated, ongoing cartographic revision, with European maps of the Pacific, the interior of the African and American continents, and the polar regions all remaining genuinely incomplete and genuinely speculative for many decades, and, in several cases, for several subsequent centuries following the initial European coastal exploration. This chapter has primarily examined a genuinely gradual and genuinely incremental process of cartographic completion that extends well beyond this particular episode's own primary historical focus, but that represents the direct continuation of exactly the same patient, accumulated cartographic tradition this whole episode has traced across so many preceding centuries and so many preceding civilizations. The considerable human cost and considerable colonial consequence that accompanied this same European age of exploration and European cartographic expansion deserves genuine acknowledgement. Alongside the purely technical cartographic achievements this chapter has primarily examined, since the same maps that recorded newly encountered coastlines and newly encountered peoples also frequently served as genuinely direct practical instruments of colonial claim-making and colonial territorial division, a genuinely significant and genuinely sobering dimension of this particular period's cartographic history that this episode notes honestly, rather than presenting the age of exploration's considerable cartographic achievement in a purely celebratory light. The considerable cartographic tradition this entire episode has traced across so many distinct ancient and medieval civilizations, from Babylonian clay tablets through Greek mathematical geography, Chinese grid-based precision, Islamic scholarly synthesis, and medieval European religious and navigational cartography alike, ultimately converged through the considerable European cartographic developments already examined in this episode's 7th chapter into the foundations of the modern systematic geographic understanding of the world that continues to develop today. Gerardus Mercator himself, alongside his own famous navigational projection already discussed extensively in this episode's 7th chapter, is also credited with popularizing the very term atlas itself for a bound collection of maps, naming his own posthumously published map collection after the mythological Greek Titan condemned to bear the weight of the heavens on his own shoulders, a genuinely fitting and genuinely enduring piece of cartographic naming that has continued in universal use for every subsequent bound map collection down to the present day, a small but genuinely lasting linguistic legacy standing alongside Mercator's own considerably more technically significant projection achievement. The considerable modern academic field of the history of cartography has, across recent decades, developed into a genuinely rich and genuinely well-established area of dedicated scholarly research in its own right, with major reference works including the multi-volume History of Cartography project, begun in the 1980s and continuing to expand its own considerable scholarly coverage across every single civilization and every single historical period this whole episode has attempted to trace, providing the kind of careful, systematic, comparative scholarly foundation that has made an episode like this one, drawing together evidence from Babylon to the Pacific Islands, to medieval Europe, to the modern satellite era, genuinely possible to responsibly attempt in the first place. The considerable modern development of crowdsourced and collaboratively edited digital mapping projects, most notably OpenStreetMap, launched in the early 21st century and built through the voluntary contributed effort of many thousands of individual amateur mapmakers worldwide, represents a genuinely striking modern echo of this whole episode's own opening observation regarding the considerable diversity of human approaches to accumulating and sharing geographic knowledge, since this same collaborative digital mapping model, drawing on the voluntary contributed observation and voluntary contributed local knowledge of an enormous distributed community of ordinary individual contributors rather than any single centralized cartographic authority, bears a genuinely interesting structural resemblance, however different in its own specific modern digital technology, to the way geographic knowledge accumulated gradually across so many individual travelers and so many individual merchants' contributions within the medieval Islamic geographic tradition this episode's 5th chapter has already examined. Modern cartography has also developed genuinely significant new theoretical and critical dimensions well beyond the purely technical achievements this chapter has primarily examined, with contemporary scholars of cartography increasingly examining maps not merely as neutral technical documents, but as genuine cultural and political artifacts reflecting the specific choices, priorities, and sometimes genuine biases of their own makers, a critical scholarly perspective that this whole episode's own repeated emphasis across every single one of its preceding chapters on how deeply each civilization's own particular religious, cosmological, and political framework shaped the actual physical appearance of its own maps has already anticipated and already illustrated at considerable length. The 18th and 19th centuries witnessed a considerable further systematic transformation of cartographic practice, with the development of increasingly precise triangulation-based land surveying techniques, enabling the production of genuinely comprehensive, genuinely accurate national topographic surveys, including Britain's own Ordnance Survey, originally established for military purposes following the mid-18th century Jacobite rising in Scotland, and eventually developing into a comprehensive civilian topographic mapping program whose own basic surveying methodology and organizational structure considerably influenced comparable national mapping programs subsequently established across numerous other nations. Alexander von Humboldt, working across the late 18th and early 19th centuries and undertaking extensive scientific expeditions across Latin America, made genuinely significant contributions to the emerging modern field of thematic cartography, producing maps that depicted not merely political boundaries and physical terrain, but systematic scientific data including isotherm lines, connecting points of equal temperature, a genuinely significant cartographic innovation that helped establish the wider modern practice of using maps to visualize and communicate complex scientific and statistical information well beyond the purely geographic content that ancient and medieval cartography this whole episode has examined had primarily focused upon. The considerable 19th century development of the physician John Snow's own celebrated cholera map of London, plotting individual disease cases against a specific contaminated water pump during an 1854 outbreak, represents a further genuinely significant milestone in this same wider tradition of thematic and scientific cartography, providing genuinely compelling visual evidence supporting Snow's own correct theory of waterborne disease transmission at a time when the wider medical establishment, still substantially committed to the ancient miasma theory already examined extensively in this channel's own earlier coverage of ancient medicine, remained genuinely skeptical. A genuinely striking example of how a carefully constructed map could serve not merely to represent already understood geography, but to actively generate genuinely new scientific insight and genuinely new scientific persuasion. The considerable 20th century polar exploration expeditions, extending human cartographic knowledge into the genuinely last remaining major unmapped terrestrial regions of the Arctic and Antarctic, represent a fitting final chapter in this whole episode's own long historical narrative of gradually expanding human geographic knowledge, since these same expeditions, undertaken by figures including Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott, in their own celebrated and, in Scott's own tragic case, fatal race to the South Pole, finally completed the basic outline of accurate world geography that this whole episode has traced from its very first Babylonian clay tablet through so many subsequent centuries of patient, incremental cartographic achievement, closing the very last significant blank spaces that had remained, quite literally, unmapped on the world's own physical surface. The considerable 20th century development of aerial photography and, later, satellite imaging technology transformed cartographic practice more fundamentally and more rapidly than perhaps any single development since the ancient world's own earliest systematic geographic observation, allowing cartographers, for the first time in the whole long history this episode has traced, to actually observe and directly photograph large stretches of the Earth's own surface from above, rather than relying entirely on ground-based surveying, travelers' reports and mathematical calculation, a genuinely revolutionary shift in cartographic methodology that finally allowed the kind of direct, comprehensive geographic verification that every single cartographer this whole episode has examined, from the ancient Babylonian tablet makers through Ptolemy, Shu, al-Idrisi, and Mercator alike, could only ever have imagined. The global positioning system, developed originally for American military purposes during the latter decades of the 20th century and eventually made available for civilian use, represents perhaps the single most transformative modern cartographic development of all, allowing any individual carrying a suitably equipped device to determine their own precise geographic location anywhere on the planet's surface with a degree of accuracy and a degree of practical convenience that no navigator or traveler across the entire span of history this episode has examined could ever have remotely imagined. A genuinely remarkable modern technological culmination of the exact same fundamental human need to know where one actually is and how to get where one is actually going that has motivated every single cartographic tradition this whole episode has traced from its very first chapter onward. The considerable modern controversy surrounding the Mercator projection's own well-known distortion of relative landmass size, already briefly touched upon in this episode's 7th chapter, produced a genuinely significant later 20th century cartographic response in the form of the Gauss-Peters projection, promoted substantially by the German historian Arno Peters beginning in the 1970s as a more genuinely equitable alternative, specifically preserving accurate relative land area rather than the navigational bearing accuracy that Mercator's own 16th century projection had originally prioritized. A modern cartographic debate that, whatever its own specific technical merits on either side, represents a genuinely direct continuation of the same basic underlying tension this whole episode has traced throughout its examination of numerous different historical cartographic traditions: the fundamental impossibility of ever perfectly projecting a curved spherical surface onto a flat map without sacrificing accuracy in some dimension or another. A genuine mathematical limitation that every single cartographer this whole episode has examined, from ancient Ptolemy through medieval al-Idrisi to modern Mercator and Peters alike, has had to grapple with in their own particular way. Modern digital mapping and satellite navigation technology, now available as an ordinary, largely unremarkable feature of countless everyday smartphones and vehicles, represents the current culmination of this whole long historical process, providing instant, continuously updated, remarkably precise geographic information to an enormous global population of ordinary users who, for the most part, give remarkably little conscious thought to the extraordinary depth of accumulated human intellectual effort stretching back through Mercator and al-Idrisi and Ptolemy and Shu, all the way to an unknown Babylonian scribe pressing careful marks into wet clay nearly 3,000 years ago, that ultimately makes this same modern everyday convenience possible. The considerable body of surviving ancient and medieval maps this whole episode has examined continues, even now, to attract genuine ongoing modern scholarly study and genuine ongoing modern public fascination, with major surviving examples including the Hereford mappae mundi, already discussed in this episode's 6th chapter, now displayed as genuine public treasures, drawing considerable modern visitor interest specifically because these old, geographically imperfect maps offer something that even the most precise modern satellite imagery cannot: a genuinely direct, genuinely tangible window into how a specific historical civilization actually understood and actually imagined the shape of its own world. The considerable historical continuity that connects an ancient Babylonian scribe's careful clay tablet to a medieval Islamic scholar's careful mathematical coordinate table, to a modern smartphone's own continuously updating satellite map, represents, for many modern historians of cartography, one of the single most genuinely moving examples available anywhere in the whole of human intellectual history of how patient, accumulated, cross-generational practical and intellectual effort developed independently by mapmakers working in civilizations separated by enormous distances of geography and enormous distances of time, nonetheless gradually converged across many centuries and through many different specific theoretical and technical frameworks toward the considerably more complete and considerably more precise picture of the world that modern cartography now provides. An achievement that, as this whole episode has tried to make clear throughout its preceding 7 chapters, was never accomplished by any single civilization working alone, but represents instead a genuinely shared inheritance drawn from every corner of the inhabited world, patiently assembled across nearly 3,000 years of careful, hopeful human effort. And so we leave the ancient art of map-making resting in the quiet dark of an old map room at night. We stood beside a Babylonian scribe, pressing careful marks into wet clay, sketching a world he understood to be centered on his own beloved city, and we followed Eratosthenes as he calculated the Earth's own circumference using nothing more than a stick, a shadow, and some genuinely careful mathematics. We walked the grid-lined maps of ancient China, and we sat beside al-Idrisi at the Sicilian court of a Christian king who trusted a Muslim scholar to draw him the most accurate map the medieval world had ever produced. We stood in the candlelit scriptorium of a medieval European monastery, watching a monk paint the whole known world as the very body of Christ, and we felt the genuine cartographic crisis that swept across Europe when Columbus returned from a voyage that fit nowhere on any existing map. We stood beside Prince Henry's own Portuguese navigators, sailing a little further down an unfamiliar coastline with each careful new voyage, and beside Magellan's own surviving crew as they finally proved, by simply sailing all the way around it, exactly how large the whole Earth actually was. We watched Mercator solve one problem for sailors while quietly creating another for how the whole world would come to picture its own relative size for centuries afterward. And we watched, at the very end, the whole long, patient tradition finally lift itself into orbit, looking back down at the very Earth it had spent so many thousands of years trying so carefully to draw. These are human stories. The mapmakers were human, working with whatever limited tools and whatever limited direct knowledge their own particular century and their own particular civilization had actually given them, filling in the unknown edges of the world with their own best guess, their own inherited myth, or their own genuinely careful mathematics, and hoping every single time that the next traveller who unrolled their map might actually find their own way home because of it. Generation after generation of careful, patient hands passing an ever more complete picture of the world along to whoever came next. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video or subscribe to the channel or leave a small quiet comment below, letting me know, if you'd like, where in the world tonight's story happens to have found you. It helps others find their way here, and every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue, and let the old world keep talking in its old slow voice. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The map has been carefully rolled back up for the night. The lamp is burning low, and there is nothing left to trace until morning. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop, let your hands open slowly, the way hands open when a long night's careful tracing has finally, at last, come to its end. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like a patient cartographer's own careful hand, finally setting down its pen, the whole wide world, for tonight at least, fully and safely drawn. Sleep well, and good night, wherever in this quiet world tonight's old story finds you resting.